The call he never made the house was too quiet again. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, not the kind you choose, the kind that settles into the walls and stays. Bob Whitaker sat by the window, the same chair he had been using for years. It faced the lake, Lake Erie, grey and restless under an overcast October sky. The wind pressed against the glass in slow, steady breaths, as if the world outside was trying to say something and couldn't quite get the words out. He wrapped his hands around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. He didn't notice. Across the room the clock ticked, loud, too loud. It always sounded louder in the evenings. Tick, tick, tick. Bob glanced at the small phone sitting on the side table. It didn't ring. It almost never did. Still, he looked at it, not directly, not all at once, just a glance, then away, then back again, like checking on something you didn't want to need. Outside, a car passed slowly down the road, tires on wet pavement. The faint hiss lingered longer than the sound itself. Bob leaned forward, elbows on his knees. For a moment, he thought he heard a phone ring. He straightened, waited, nothing, just the wind again. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Not mine," he muttered, almost out loud. It rarely was. The routine didn't change much anymore. Morning came quietly. Coffee, same mug, same place. A glance at the mailbox, usually empty. A slow walk down to the lake, fishing rod in hand, not always to catch anything, just to sit. That morning had been colder than most, the kind of cold that doesn't bite, just lingers, slips into your sleeves, into your bones. Bob stood near the water, staring out across the surface. The lake moved in slow, heavy ripples, like it was tired too. A gull cried somewhere overhead. He cast the line without thinking. Muscle memory, years of it. The lure hit the water with a soft plop. Circles spread outward, then disappeared. He watched them fade. Just like everything else, back in the house, the smell of coffee had already settled into the air. Old wood, faint dust, something familiar but distant. Bob walked into the kitchen and paused. The phone, still there, same place. He stepped closer, as if inspecting it. No notifications, no missed calls. Of course not. He rested his hand beside it, not touching it. Then, almost unconsciously, he turned it face down. The gesture was small, automatic, like closing a door you didn't want to open. Later that afternoon, he opened the drawer in the hallway. He didn't mean to. At least, that's what he told himself. Inside were things he hadn't looked at in years. Old receipts, a rusted key, a folded map, and beneath them, a photograph. Bob hesitated before picking it up. The edges were worn, slightly bent. He knew what it was before he even turned it over. Still, he looked. A younger version of himself stood in the picture, shoulders straighter, eyes clearer, less tired. And next to him, her, Maggie, Margaret Collins. She was laughing in the photo, not posing, not looking at the camera, looking at him, like something had just been said, something small, maybe even unimportant, but it had mattered enough to make her laugh like that. Warm, unfiltered, real. Bob swallowed. His thumb brushed lightly over the surface of the photo. There was something about that moment, something unfinished. He stared at it longer than he meant to. Then, carefully, almost deliberately, he placed it back in the drawer, closed it. Evening came early. The light faded fast this time of year. By 6, the house was already dim. By 7, it felt like night had settled in completely. Bob sat back in his chair by the window. The lake had disappeared into darkness. Only the sound remained. Wind, water, distance, and then a phone rang, clear this time, sharp, close. Bob turned quickly. His eyes locked onto the phone on the table. It didn't move. It didn't light up. It didn't ring. The sound continued for another second, then stopped. Somewhere else, another house, another room, another life. Bob leaned back slowly. His gaze stayed on the phone, longer this time. His hand shifted slightly, as if he might reach for it, but he didn't. He had always told himself the same thing. There would be time. There was always time. Tomorrow, next week, when things settled down. He had believed that. For a long time. The clock ticked again. Tick, tick, tick. Bob looked at the phone one more time, then away. He didn't notice that his fingers were still slightly curled, as if they remembered something his mind tried to forget. Somewhere, far in the back of his thoughts, there was a number, and a moment, and a call he had never made. Mornings came quietly in Bob's house. No alarms, no voices, no urgency, just light, thin pale light slipping through the curtains, slowly revealing the same room, the same chair, the same man. Bob was already awake before the sun fully rose. He often was, not because he had somewhere to be, just because sleep didn't stay as long as it used to. He lay there for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house had its own language, a soft creak in the floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint whistle of wind pressing against the windows. Familiar sounds, predictable, safe. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment before standing. No rush. There was never any rush. The kitchen looked exactly as he had left it, clean, ordered, quiet. Bob reached for the coffee maker without thinking. The motion was automatic, measured, practiced. He didn't need to look. His hands knew where everything was. Water, filter, coffee grounds, click. The machine came to life with a low hum. He stood there while it brewed, one hand resting lightly on the counter. Not impatient, just waiting. He glanced at the phone, still face down. He didn't turn it over. He carried the mug to the window. Same chair, same view. The lake stretched out under a pale grey sky, the horizon barely visible. Everything blended into everything else, water into sky, distance into memory. He took a sip. Too hot. He set the mug down and wrapped his hands around it instead, letting the warmth settle into his fingers. Outside, a gull drifted low over the water, then disappeared into the fog. Bob watched it go. He didn't follow it with his eyes for long. He rarely followed anything for long. After breakfast, if you could call toast and coffee breakfast, he grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The air was colder than yesterday, sharper. It made him straighten slightly, whether he meant to or not. The path down to the lake was worn, familiar beneath his feet. Small stones shifted under his boots. Leaves, damp and heavy, clung to the ground. Fall was settling in deeper now. He noticed things like that, not in a poetic way, just in a way that told him time was moving. At the water's edge, he paused. Same spot. He always stood there for a moment before setting up his rod, not thinking about anything specific, just letting the quiet settle in. He cast the line. The motion was smooth, effortless. The lure hit the water. Ripples spread, then disappeared. Fishing wasn't really about catching anything anymore. He couldn't remember the last time he brought something home. That wasn't the point. The point was the waiting, the stillness, the absence of decisions. Out here, nothing asked anything of him. A man walked his dog along the far path. Bob noticed him in the distance. They didn't wave. They never did. But they recognized each other. That was enough. After a while, Bob reeled the line back in. Not because something bit, just because it felt like time. He packed up slowly, carefully, like there was no reason to hurry, because there wasn't. Back at the house, he hung his jacket by the door. Same hook, same place. He paused again in the hallway. That drawer. He didn't open it this time, but he knew it was there. The afternoon passed in pieces, small, quiet pieces. He sat in the garage for a while, working on an old radio. The back panel lay open, wires exposed like veins. He adjusted something inside, turned a dial. Static. Then a faint voice, a fragment of music. He tilted his head, listening. For a second it almost came through clearly. Then it slipped back into noise. Bob adjusted the dial again, carefully, patiently, trying to find the right frequency. He stayed there longer than he planned, longer than necessary. The radio never fully cleared, but he didn't turn it off. Later, he returned to the living room. The light was already fading again. Days were getting shorter. Or maybe they just felt that way. He walked past the phone, paused. This time he turned it over. The screen lit up briefly. Nothing. No messages. No missed calls. No names. Just the time. He stared at it for a moment longer than usual. Then, almost without thinking, he picked it up, held it in his hand. His thumb hovered over the screen, not moving, not pressing anything, just there, somewhere deep in his memory. There was another phone, heavier, colder, a different time, a different version of him, standing in a place that smelled like rain and metal, listening to a sound that stretched between hope and fear. Bob blinked. The moment passed. He placed the phone back on the table, carefully, exactly where it had been. Evening settled in again. Quiet, predictable, unchanged. He sat down, looked out at the lake. Then, without realizing it, he listened, not to the wind, not to the water, but for something else, something that didn't come. He told himself, like he always did, there would be time, but for the first time in a long while, that thought didn't feel as certain as it used to. The drawer had not been opened in years, at least not with any real intention. It was one of those places in the house that existed more out of habit than necessity, a quiet storage of things that no longer belonged to the present, but had not yet been given permission to disappear. Bob stood in the hallway longer than he needed to that morning, his hand resting lightly against the wooden surface, as if the simple act of opening it required a decision he was not entirely ready to make. Outside, the sky hung low and heavy, pressing a dull grey light through the window at the end of the corridor, the kind of light that made everything look older than it was. He exhaled slowly and pulled the drawer open. The contents were exactly as he remembered, which somehow made them feel even more distant. A collection of objects that once had purpose now lay quietly side by side, stripped of urgency. A folded road map with frayed edges, a rusted spare key, receipts from places that likely no longer existed in the same form, if at all. He moved a few things aside, not searching for anything specific, or at least not admitting to it, and then his fingers stopped. The photograph was still there. For a moment he did not pick it up. He simply looked at it, as though acknowledging his presence was already enough to shift something inside him. When he finally lifted it, he did so carefully, almost respectfully, as if it were more fragile than it appeared. The image had faded slightly with time, but not enough to erase what mattered. There he was, decades younger, standing with a posture that suggested certainty, or at least the absence of doubt. His shoulders were squared, his expression composed in that restrained way he had always carried himself even then, and beside him, Maggie, Margaret Collins. She was not looking at the camera. That was the first thing that always stood out. While he had been facing forward, aware of the moment being captured, she had been turned slightly toward him, caught mid-laugh, as though the photograph had interrupted something more real. Her expression held a kind of warmth that did not feel posed. It was spontaneous, unguarded, and entirely directed at him. Bob felt something shift in his chest, subtle but undeniable. He traced the edge of the photo with his thumb, not quite touching her image, but close enough to feel the memory pressing through. There had been a time when her name was not something hidden away in a drawer. There had been a time when it lived in the open. He leaned against the wall, the photograph still in his hand, and allowed the memory to surface, not all at once, but gradually, like something long submerged rising carefully toward light. It had been summer, not the kind of summer marked by big events or dramatic changes, but one defined by small, steady moments that seemed unimportant at the time and only later revealed their weight. He had met her at the school, not intentionally. He had been there for a routine inspection, something related to a structural update that the district had approved, the kind of job he could have completed without remembering anything about the day. But she had been there in the hallway, standing near a classroom door, holding a stack of papers and speaking to someone just out of view. He remembered noticing her voice before anything else. It carried in a way that was calm but clear, steady without being sharp, and it had a warmth that did not demand attention, but held it once you heard it. When she turned toward him, Their eyes met briefly, just long enough to register presence, not long enough to create meaning. At least, that was what he had told himself at the time. Their first real conversation had been accidental, or so it seemed. He had been reviewing something near the end of the corridor when she approached, asking if he needed access to a locked classroom. There had been a key in her hand, held loosely, as though she had anticipated the question before it was asked. Their exchange had been simple, practical, unremarkable, and yet something about the way she listened, fully, without interruption, had stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed more often. At first, it was still incidental, a greeting in the hallway, a brief comment about the weather, a shared observation about the noise from ongoing repairs, but gradually those moments stretched. A few minutes became longer conversations. Topics shifted from work to books, from schedules to memories. She spoke easily, but not carelessly. There was intention in what she said, and more importantly, in what she chose to ask. She asked questions that he was not used to answering, not technical ones, personal ones, and she waited for the answers. Bob closed his eyes for a moment, the image still vivid despite the years that had passed. He remembered how unusual it had felt to be seen without having to explain himself, how unfamiliar it was to be asked something and not immediately search for the most efficient, least complicated response. With Maggie, silence had not felt like avoidance. It had felt like space. He opened his eyes again and looked down at the photograph. The version of himself standing beside her seemed almost like someone else now, not because he had changed dramatically, but because something essential had shifted in a way he had never fully acknowledged. He placed the photograph back into the drawer, though this time he did not push it beneath the other items. He left it on top, visible. As he closed the drawer, his hand lingered on the handle for a second longer than necessary. In his mind her name surfaced again. Clear, unavoidable, Margaret. He stepped back slowly, the hallway returning to its usual stillness, but something about it no longer felt quite the same. For the first time in years, the past had not remained contained. It had followed him out, and somewhere, just beneath the surface of that memory, there was something unfinished, not the beginning, not the middle, but something that had never reached its end. The memory did not leave him when he stepped away from the drawer. It followed him into the kitchen, lingered in the quiet hum of the coffee maker, and settled beside him as he sat once again by the window overlooking the lake. It had been easier, once, to keep the past in separate compartments, neatly contained, rarely revisited, but now something about the photograph, about the simple act of seeing her face again, had shifted that balance. It was no longer a distant recollection. It was present, uncomfortably so. Bob stared out at the water, but he was no longer seeing it as it was. Instead, he saw the school again, the long hallway, the filtered afternoon light, and Maggie. Their conversations had changed over time, though he had not noticed it happening while they were in it. At first, they had been anchored in practical things, work schedules, small observations, shared inconveniences, but gradually, without any clear transition, they had begun to take on weight. She spoke about books she loved, not just in terms of plot, but in terms of how they made her feel, what they revealed about people, about choices, about the quiet moments that define lives more than the obvious ones. Bob listened more than he spoke, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was not used to saying it. Still, she did not seem to mind. She had a way of filling silence without overwhelming it, of allowing space without letting it turn into distance. One afternoon, they had stayed late. The building was nearly empty, the usual noise replaced by a kind of echoing stillness that made every sound feel more deliberate. Bob had been finishing a report when she appeared in the doorway. "Do you ever stop working?" she asked, though there was no judgment in her tone. He glanced up, slightly caught off guard. "When it's done," he replied. She smiled faintly and stepped inside, leaning lightly against the desk. "And when is that?" she asked. He paused, considering the question longer than it required. "When it needs to be." She tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "That sounds like something you've been saying for a long time," she said. He did not respond immediately. There was something about the way she said it, not accusing, not critical, just observant, that made it difficult to dismiss. They left the building together that evening. The air outside was warm, carrying the last traces of summer. The sun had already begun to lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot. They walked side by side, not quite close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the presence of the other. At some point, she slowed her pace slightly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for the right moment," she continued, "and then later realize it already passed?" The question landed quietly, but it did not pass through him easily. He considered deflecting it, giving a practical answer, turning it into something less personal. Instead, he said, "I think sometimes it's hard to know when the moment is actually happening." She looked at him, not surprised, but not entirely satisfied either. "Or maybe," she said gently, "we know. We just don't always choose it." That conversation stayed with him, longer than most, long enough to return, uninvited at unexpected times. The shift between them was not dramatic. There was no single event that marked a clear turning point. It was subtle, gradual, but undeniable. Their conversations became more direct, less guarded. She shared more about her life, about the things she had hoped for, the paths she had considered, the choices she had made, not because they were easy, but because they felt honest. In return, she asked him about his, not just what he had done, but why. Bob found those questions difficult, not because he lacked answers, but because he had never needed to articulate them before. He had built his life on decisions that made sense, stable choices, predictable outcomes. There had always been a next step, a logical progression. But Maggie did not ask about the steps. She asked about the reasons. One evening the conversation changed. There was no clear warning, no signal that it would be different, but it was. They had been sitting outside, near the edge of the school grounds, where the noise from the road faded just enough to make conversation feel more private. The air was cooler that day. Fall was beginning to make itself known. She had been quiet for a while, which was unusual for her. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Finally she spoke. "You don't let people see you," she said. The words were not harsh. They were careful, measured, but they were direct. Bob felt the instinct to respond quickly, to correct, to explain. But something about her tone made him pause. "I'm here," he said after a moment. She shook her head slightly. "You're present," she replied. "That's not the same thing." He looked away briefly, toward the horizon where the light was fading. "I don't see the difference," he said. She watched him for a few seconds before answering. "I think you do," she said quietly. The silence that followed was heavier than any they had shared before, not empty, but full of something neither of them had fully named. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I'm not asking you to change," she said. "I'm just asking you to be honest with me, with yourself." He nodded, though the gesture felt incomplete. He understood the words, but understanding and acting had never been the same thing for him. She stood after a moment, brushing her hands lightly against her coat. "I don't want to guess what you feel," she continued. "I don't want to assume." He looked up at her. "You don't have to," he said. It was meant to reassure, but it wasn't enough. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she said the words that would stay with him longer than anything else. "Call me when you're ready to be honest." It was not a demand, not an ultimatum spoken in anger. It was calm, clear, final in a way that did not feel dramatic, but certain. She turned and walked away before he could respond. Not quickly, not abruptly, just without waiting. Bob remained where he was, watching until she disappeared from view. He told himself he would call. Of course he would. There was no reason not to. At the time it had felt simple, almost inevitable. Now, sitting in his quiet house, years later, he closed his eyes briefly. That moment returned with a clarity that felt sharper than the present. He had known what she was asking. He had understood what the call meant. It wasn't about dialing a number. It was about saying something he had never allowed himself to say, and even then, even in that moment, something inside him had already begun to hesitate. Not because he didn't care, but because he did. The day itself had not begun with any sense of importance. There had been no sign, no indication that it would become a moment he would return to again and again for the rest of his life. It arrived like any other day, quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable in its simplicity. And perhaps that was what made it so dangerous. The sky had been overcast since morning, a low ceiling of clouds stretching endlessly across the horizon, muting the light and flattening the world into shades of grey. The air carried the heavy stillness that often comes before rain, as though something was waiting to be released, but had not yet decided when. Bob had gone through his routine without interruption. Work had been steady, predictable, measurable, numbers made sense, structures held, plans followed logic. There was comfort in that. But even as he moved through the day, There had been something else beneath it. Not a thought exactly, more like a presence, a quiet awareness that did not demand attention but refused to disappear. Her words, "Call me when you're ready to be honest." He had replayed them more than once, though never all the way through. Each time he would let the memory approach, then pull away before it fully formed, as if there were a boundary he was not prepared to cross. By late afternoon the air had shifted. The first drops of rain fell without warning, soft at first, barely noticeable against the pavement, then gradually building into a steady rhythm that filled the spaces between sounds. Bob stood just inside the entrance of a small convenience store, watching the rain collect in uneven patterns along the sidewalk. He could have waited. There was no urgency, no appointment, no expectation. But something about standing still in that moment felt heavier than moving. So he stepped outside. The rain was colder than he expected. It soaked through his jacket faster than it should have, clinging to the fabric, seeping in slowly but persistently. The streets were already beginning to reflect the dim glow of streetlights, the surfaces shimmering under the constant movement of water. He walked without thinking too much about direction, just forward, and then he saw it. The phone booth stood at the corner of the next block, slightly tilted, its glass panels streaked with water and age. It was not new, not particularly well maintained, but it was there, solid, unmistakable. He slowed his pace. For a moment he considered walking past it. There was no reason to stop, no obligation, no one watching, but his steps shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, then deliberately. He reached the booth and stood just outside it, the rain tapping steadily against the glass, creating a dull rhythmic sound that seemed to isolate the space from everything else around it. Inside the light flickered faintly, not enough to fail, just enough to feel uncertain. Bob pushed the door open. It resisted slightly, then gave way with a low creak. The air inside was different, warmer but stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of old coins and damp surfaces. He stepped in and closed the door behind him. The noise of the rain softened immediately, not gone, just distant, contained. For a few seconds he did nothing. He simply stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the space, his breath slightly uneven, though he would not have admitted it. The phone hung in front of him, black, solid, uncomplicated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. The number was written clearly. He did not need it. He knew the number, but having it there made it feel official, real. His fingers hovered over the keypad. He hesitated, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention. Just a pause, a fraction longer than necessary. Then he began to dial, each button pressed with a soft, distinct sound. One number, then another, slowly, deliberately. When the last digit was entered, he lifted the receiver to his ear. The tone came through immediately, steady, clear, then ringing. The sound stretched between each pause, not loud, not urgent, but present. He listened. One ring. He could still hang up. It would mean nothing. No one would know. 2 rings. He imagined her on the other end. Where would she be? At home, reading, maybe already expecting the call. 3 rings. He adjusted his grip on the receiver. His hand felt slightly tighter than before. 4 rings. He thought about what he would say, not the words themselves, but the meaning behind them, because this was not just a call. It was an answer. 5 rings, and suddenly that answer did not feel as clear as it had before. What if he said the wrong thing? What if honesty meant uncertainty? What if he did not have the words she was asking for? 6 rings. The silence between the rings began to feel heavier, longer. His thoughts moved faster now, not structured, not controlled. What if this changed everything? What if it demanded more than he could give? What if he said something he could not take back? 7 rings, his grip tightened, and then he pulled the receiver away from his ear. The ringing continued faintly in the distance, no longer centered, no longer immediate. For a moment he held the phone there, suspended between action and retreat. Then, slowly, he placed the receiver back. The sound stopped, just like that. The booth fell silent again. Bob stood there, unmoving. The rain continued outside, steady and indifferent, tracing the glass in thin, uneven lines. Nothing had changed, and yet something had. He stepped out of the booth a few seconds later, pulling the door closed behind him. The rain met him again, colder now, more noticeable. He walked away without looking back. At the time it had felt like a pause, a delay, a decision that could be revisited. He told himself he would call later, when he had clearer thoughts, better words, more certainty. There was no reason to rush. There was always time. The next day arrived without consequence. The sun returned, breaking through the clouds, as if the rain had never happened, as if the previous evening had not held any weight beyond his passing. Bob woke at the usual hour, his routine unfolding with the same quiet precision that had defined most of his life. Coffee, kitchen, silence. There was no immediate sense that anything had shifted, no interruption, no visible change, and that, more than anything, reassured him. He moved through the morning as he always did, focusing on small, manageable tasks that required no reflection beyond their completion. There was comfort in the familiar sequence of actions, in the predictability of steps that led nowhere unexpected. If something had been altered the night before, it did not show itself, not yet. He did not think about the phone booth immediately. He allowed the memory to remain just out of reach, not denying it, but not inviting it either. There would be time to consider it later. There always was. At work, everything continued as expected. Conversations remained practical. Problems had solutions. Time moved in measured increments, marked by schedules and responsibilities that did not require emotional investment. It was easy to stay within that structure, easy to remain where things made sense, but somewhere beneath that surface, something lingered, not loudly, not insistently, just enough to be noticed when everything else grew quiet. By late afternoon, he found himself pausing more often than usual. Small pauses, barely noticeable to anyone else, a moment before responding, a second longer before moving. Once he reached into his pocket, feeling for something that was no longer there. The piece of paper, the number. He stopped halfway through the motion, his hand lingering before withdrawing. It wasn't necessary. He knew the number. The thought came quickly, almost defensively. I'll call later, not today, but soon, when it made more sense, when he had time to think it through properly. That reasoning settled easily, comfortably, like something he had practiced before. That evening he returned home and went about his routine without deviation. He made dinner, simple, unremarkable. He sat in his chair by the window, watched the lake, listened to the wind. The phone sat on the table beside him, silent. He glanced at it once, then again. He could call now. There was nothing stopping him, no interruption, no complication. He reached toward it. His hand hovered just above the surface, then stopped, not because he had decided against it, not exactly, but because the moment did not feel right. The words were still not clear. The timing was not ideal. It would be better to wait just a little longer. He withdrew his hand. The silence returned. Days passed, not many, but enough. Each day carried the same quiet reassurance. Nothing had gone wrong. Nothing had been lost. Nothing had changed. And slowly, almost without noticing, that belief settled deeper. The urgency faded. The need to act became less immediate, less pressing. The memory of the call remained, but its edges softened, its weight shifted. It became something that could be revisited later, at a better time, under better circumstances. He still thought about her, not constantly, but often enough, in moments when the day slowed down, when the noise of everything else quieted. He imagined the conversation, how it might go, what he might say, but imagining required less than doing. And so the days continued, one after another, uninterrupted, unchanged, until one day he realized he had not thought about calling at all, and that realization, when it came, did not feel like a loss. It felt like relief, which, in its own quiet way, changed everything. The transition did not happen all at once, nor did it announce itself in any way that could be clearly marked or remembered. Instead, it unfolded quietly through a series of choices that felt reasonable at the time, each one small enough to seem harmless, yet together forming a direction he never consciously decided to take. In the months that followed, Bob stopped expecting the call to happen, not because he had made a firm decision to let it go, but because the absence of action slowly reshaped his sense of what mattered. The urgency that had once accompanied the thought of calling Maggie faded into something less defined, less immediate, until eventually it became just another possibility among many others, one that no longer demanded attention. Work remained steady, as it always had. Projects came and went, each one offering the same familiar structure, a beginning, a process, a completion. There was comfort in that predictability, in knowing what was required and how to deliver it. It allowed him to move forward without having to confront anything uncertain. It was during this time that he met Laura. The circumstances were unremarkable. She had been introduced through mutual acquaintances at a small gathering, one of those events that felt more like an obligation than an opportunity. The room had been filled with polite conversations, measured laughter, and the quiet exchange of expectations that often accompany people at similar stages of life. Laura was easy to talk to, not in a way that challenged him, but in a way that required little from him beyond presence. She asked straightforward questions, accepted straightforward answers, and did not press for more than he was willing to offer. There was a steadiness to her, a kind of emotional clarity that did not demand exploration. She knew what she wanted, or at least appeared to, and she moved toward it without hesitation. For Bob, that felt manageable. Their conversations were comfortable, though not particularly memorable. They spoke about work, about daily routines, about the kinds of things that filled time without requiring reflection. There were no silences that needed to be interpreted, no questions that lingered after they were asked. And perhaps that was what made it easier. The relationship developed gradually, following a path that seemed almost predetermined. They saw each other regularly, they shared meals, they learned the outlines of each other's lives without necessarily exploring the deeper layers beneath them. There was no dramatic moment of realization, no sudden shift that marked the beginning of something significant. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of familiarity, of shared time that slowly took on the shape of something expected. At some point, without either of them naming it directly, the relationship became official. Bob found himself adjusting to the rhythm of it without much resistance. There were routines now that included another person, plans made in advance, weekends accounted for, conversations that filled the space that had once been silent. It was not uncomfortable, but it was not transformative either. Occasionally, something would surface, a thought, a memory, a name, Maggie. It would appear without warning, often in moments when nothing else demanded his attention. A brief pause in conversation, a quiet evening, the sound of a voice that carried a tone he almost recognized. Each time the memory would bring with it a subtle shift, a momentary sense that something had been left unresolved. But those moments did not last. They were quickly followed by the same reasoning he had relied on before. It had been the right decision. It had been too uncertain, too complicated, and more importantly, it was over. Laura, in contrast, represented something clear, something stable, a life that could be understood and maintained without disruption. When they eventually married, the decision felt less like a turning point and more like a continuation. There had been no hesitation, no internal conflict that demanded resolution. Everything aligned in a way that made the choice seem logical, even inevitable. The ceremony itself was simple, a small gathering, a quiet exchange of vows, a moment that passed quickly, leaving behind a structure that would define the years that followed. From the outside it was a good life, respectable, predictable, whole. They built routines together, shared responsibilities, created a home that functioned well, even if it lacked something harder to define. There were no major conflicts, no dramatic breakdowns, just a steady progression of days that moved forward without interruption. And yet there were moments, small ones, easy to overlook, moments when silence lingered a little longer than necessary, when conversations ended without quite reaching anything meaningful, when the space between what was said and what was felt became noticeable, even if it was never addressed. Bob did not question it, not openly, because nothing was wrong. Everything worked, and in a life built on the idea of making the right decisions, that was enough. Or at least, it seemed to be. When their son was born, the world did not change in the dramatic way Bob had once imagined it might. There was no sudden clarity, no overwhelming shift that redefined everything he understood about himself or his life. Instead, the change came gradually, settling into the rhythm of their days the same way everything else had, quietly, without demanding attention. They named him Daniel. From the beginning he was calm, observant, not the kind of child who demanded constant reassurance, but one who seemed to take in the world carefully, as though trying to understand it before reacting to it. Bob noticed that. He appreciated it. It made things easier. In those early years, there was a structure to everything. Schedules, feedings, sleep, the kind of routine that could be followed, adjusted, and maintained. Bob approached it the same way he approached most things in his life, with a focus on stability, on providing what was necessary, on ensuring that everything functioned as it should. He was present, he was responsible, he did what was expected of him. But presence, as Maggie had once said, was not the same as something else. Daniel grew quickly, as children do. The small manageable tasks of early childhood gave way to moments that required something less tangible, attention that could not be measured, responses that could not be planned in advance. There were questions, simple at first, then more complex. Why is the sky grey today? Do you like your job? Were you ever scared when you were younger? Bob answered them. Of course he did. But his answers were often practical, direct, shaped by what he believed was useful rather than what might have been felt. The sky was grey because of the weather patterns. His job was stable. Fear was something you learned to manage. Daniel listened. He nodded, but sometimes he did not ask a follow-up question. Sometimes he simply accepted the answer and moved on. At first, Bob did not notice the difference. It was subtle, gradual. The distance did not appear suddenly. It formed over time in small, almost invisible ways, in the conversations that ended too quickly, in the moments that could have been explored further, but were not, in the space between what was said and what might have been asked. Laura filled much of that space. She spoke more easily, she explained, she listened in a way that invited more in return. Daniel responded to that, naturally. Bob watched it happen without fully understanding it. He saw their connection, recognized its ease, and accepted it as something that simply existed without questioning why it did not form in the same way between him and his son. As Daniel grew older, their interactions became more structured, more defined. How was school? Fine. Do you have homework? Yes. The conversations remained functional, efficient, They rarely extended beyond what was necessary. Bob told himself that this was normal, that not every relationship needed depth to be meaningful, that consistency and reliability were forms of care in themselves, and in many ways they were. But there were moments when Daniel would hesitate as if considering whether to say something more, moments when a question would form but not be asked, moments when silence settled in a way that felt familiar. Bob recognized that silence, though he did not name it. Years passed. School became college. Childhood became adulthood. Daniel moved into his own life, building something separate, something that no longer required daily interaction or shared routines. They stayed in touch. Of course they did. Calls on occasion, visits during holidays, updates exchanged in measured conversations that covered what needed to be known. Nothing was broken, but something was missing. Bob noticed it more clearly now in the quiet of his later years, when the absence of noise made everything else more distinct. Their conversations felt careful, polite, as though both of them understood the boundaries without ever having discussed them. One evening, after a particularly brief phone call, Bob remained seated for a long time, the receiver still in his hand, long after the line had gone silent. He stared ahead, not at anything specific, but at the space where something should have been. It was not regret. Not exactly. It was recognition, a quiet awareness that something had taken shape over time without his full participation. That distance did not always arrive with conflict. Sometimes it simply grew, silently, until it felt like it had always been there. For years, Bob had allowed the memory of that evening to soften at the edges, as if time itself could reduce its weight. He had revisited it occasionally, but never completely, never with the kind of attention that might force him to confront what had truly happened. But memory, like certain sounds, does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It waits, and when it returns, it does so with a clarity that feels almost present. That day, the day of the call, had not ended when he stepped out of the phone booth. In his mind it continued. It replayed, not as a continuous sequence, but in fragments, each piece carrying more meaning than it had at the time. The rain, the glass, the sound of the ringing. Bob sat in his chair now, decades later, his gaze fixed somewhere between the window and the past, and for the first time in a long while he allowed himself to stay with the memory instead of turning away from it. He saw himself clearly, not as he imagined he had been, but as he had actually been, standing inside that narrow booth, shoulders slightly tense, breath just uneven enough to notice, though he would have denied it then. He remembered the way the receiver had felt in his hand, heavier than expected, as though it carried more than just sound. The ringing had been steady, unhurried, each pause between the tones long enough to allow a decision. At the time he had told himself that he was thinking, that he was being careful, that he was making sure he said the right thing. But now with distance, he saw something else. He had not been searching for the right words. He had been searching for certainty. And when it did not arrive, he chose not to act. The realization did not come with a dramatic shift. It settled slowly, quietly, but once it formed, it did not leave. Bob leaned back slightly, his hand resting on the arm of the chair, fingers relaxed but still, as if holding on to something invisible. He remembered something else now, something he had not allowed himself to consider before. There had been a moment, just before he placed the receiver back, when he had almost spoken, not to her, to himself. A brief, unformed thought. Just say it. It had come and gone in less than a second, so quickly that it had not seemed important. But now, that moment felt larger than everything that followed, because it had been the closest he had come, not to making the call, but to being honest. Bob closed his eyes briefly, and the memory sharpened even further. He imagined it differently now, not as it had happened, but as it could have. The phone ringing, her answering, a pause, and then him speaking, not perfectly, not with clarity or confidence, but honestly. He did not know what would have happened after that, and that was the point. He had never allowed himself to find out. The unknown had not been something he moved toward. It had been something he avoided, and in avoiding it, he had created something far more permanent, a certainty that nothing would change. Bob opened his eyes again. The room returned, the lake, the fading light. For years he had thought of that moment as something small, a missed call, a delay, a decision that could have been corrected. But now he understood it differently. It had not been a pause, it had been a choice, not made loudly, not declared, but made all the same, and everything that followed, every decision, every path, every distance that grew quietly over time, had moved outward from that point, like ripples in water, unnoticed at first, until they reached the shore. The end of his marriage did not come with the kind of clarity people often expect from such moments. There was no single argument that marked a breaking point, no dramatic confrontation that forced everything into the open. Instead, it unfolded gradually, in the same quiet way their relationship had been built. It was not the result of something that had happened. It was the result of something that had not. By the time they both began to recognize it, the distance between them had already settled into place. It had become part of the structure of their lives, as familiar and as unremarkable as the routines they followed each day. They spoke, they functioned, they continued, but they no longer connected. The realization came not through conflict, but through absence, through the quiet understanding that there was nothing left to resolve because nothing had been addressed. One evening, Laura sat across from him at the kitchen table, her hands resting calmly around a cup of tea that had long since cooled. The room was silent, but not in a way that felt temporary. It was the kind of silence that had been building over time. "I think we've been doing this for a while," she said, her voice steady, without accusation. Bob looked at her, not confused, but not entirely certain what she meant. "Doing what?" he asked. She held his gaze for a moment before answering. "Living next to each other," she said, "instead of with each other." The words did not strike him as harsh. They were not meant to. They were accurate. He considered responding, searching for something that might shift the direction of the conversation, but nothing came, not because he disagreed, but because he did not know how to change what she had described. "I don't think either of us did anything wrong," she continued after a moment, "but I also don't think we did what we needed to." Bob nodded slowly. It felt like the appropriate response, measured, accepting. There was no argument, no attempt to defend or deny, because there was nothing to defend. In the weeks that followed, the decision was made with the same quiet practicality that had defined much of their life together. They separated their belongings, divided responsibilities, adjusted routines. Everything was handled with care, respect, efficiency. From the outside, it might have seemed like a well-managed transition, but inside, it felt like something else, not loss in the dramatic sense, but a kind of emptiness that did not announce itself loudly, a space where something had once existed, even if it had never been fully formed. When Laura moved out, the house did not feel unfamiliar. It felt unchanged, and that was what made it noticeable. The absence was not marked by disruption. It was marked by the realization that nothing essential had shifted. Bob walked through the rooms in the days that followed, noticing small details that had once belonged to both of them but now existed without context. A chair that remained in place, a shelf that still held items no one would use, a silence that no longer required explanation. He resumed his routines. Of course he did. Coffee in the morning, work, evenings by the window. From a practical standpoint, everything continued. But something had settled beneath it. Not regret, not yet, but a quiet awareness that a life could function and still feel incomplete. That absence did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it simply remained. Bob sat by the window that evening, the lake stretching out before him, unchanged as always, its surface moving in slow, steady patterns that did not reflect anything beyond themselves. He listened to the silence, not resisting it, not questioning it, just recognizing it for what it was, not new, not sudden, but something that had been forming for a long time and had finally taken shape. It happened on a day that gave no indication it would be different from any other. The morning unfolded in its usual quiet sequence, with the same measured movements and familiar silences that had come to define Bob's life. The lake outside his window lay still beneath a pale sky, and the air carried that particular stillness that comes in late autumn, when the world seems to be preparing for something slower, something more permanent. He had no plans beyond the ordinary, no expectations, no reason to anticipate change. The envelope arrived in the afternoon. It was among a small stack of mail that had been left in his box, most of it routine, bills, advertisements, notices that required nothing more than a glance before being set aside. This one was different, not because it was marked in any obvious way, but because of how it felt in his hand. Lighter, older, more deliberate. He stood in the kitchen for a moment before opening it, turning it over once, then again, as though something about its weight or texture might reveal its contents without requiring him to break the seal. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting stopped him. It was not something he had seen in years, not something he had expected to see again. And yet there it was, careful, measured, slightly slanted in a way that carried both intention and ease. Bob felt something shift in his chest, not sharply, but enough to interrupt the rhythm of his breathing. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he placed it on the table and stepped back, as though distance might help him regain control over something that had already begun to move beyond it. For several minutes he did nothing. The house remained quiet. The clock continued its steady ticking. Then, slowly, he returned to the table. He sat down, picked up the envelope again. This time he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. He unfolded it with deliberate attention, smoothing it out against the surface of the table. The handwriting matched the envelope. There was no doubt now. He began to read. The words were simple, not long, not complicated, but they carried something that had not diminished with time. The letter was not written recently. That much became clear as he moved through it. There were references to things that belonged to another time, another version of the world he had once occupied. It had been written years ago, perhaps even decades, and yet it had only just reached him. He read it again, slower this time, taking in each line, each pause, each space between the words. She had written about their last conversation, not with accusation, not with regret, but with clarity. She had not asked why he didn't call. She had not demanded an explanation. Instead, she had written something else. I think you already knew what you wanted to say. I just don't think you believed it was enough. Bob lowered the letter slightly, his eyes lingering on that line as though it carried more weight than the rest. He continued reading. She wrote about moving, about starting somewhere new, about the way certain choices do not feel like endings at first, but become them over time. There was no bitterness in her words, no attempt to rewrite what had happened, only acknowledgement, and then, at the end, a single sentence that felt both final and open at the same time. I hope one day you say what you've been holding on to, even if it's not to me. Bob sat there for a long time after finishing. The letter remained in his hands, though he was no longer reading it. The room had not changed. The light remained the same. The quiet continued, but something had shifted, not in the world around him, but in the way he understood it. For years he had believed that the moment had passed without consequence, that what had been left undone had simply faded. But now he saw something else. It had not disappeared. It had continued, in ways he had not allowed himself to consider. The letter did not accuse him. It did not demand anything from him, but it removed something he had relied on for a long time, the belief that silence had ended the story. Bob folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. His eyes moved slowly across the room before settling once again on the phone. This time, he did not look away. The decision did not arrive with certainty. It did not present itself as a clear conclusion or a sudden realization that demanded immediate action. Instead, it formed gradually, emerging from the quiet space the letter had created. For the first time in years, Bob allowed himself to consider something he had avoided entirely: finding her. The thought felt unfamiliar at first, not because it was new, but because it had never been allowed to take shape. It had existed, perhaps, as a distant possibility, something that could be imagined but not pursued. Now it remained. He sat at the table longer than he needed to, the letter still within reach, as though his presence alone was enough to hold the idea in place. Where would he begin? The question was simple, the answer was not. Time had passed, too much of it. People moved, lives changed, names shifted into new contexts, and yet something in him resisted the idea that she had simply disappeared. He stood up slowly, the movement deliberate, as though acting too quickly might break whatever had begun to form. The house felt different now, not in structure, not in sound, but in possibility. For years it had contained everything he needed. Now it felt like a place he might leave. He walked toward the small desk near the living room, where he kept a few documents, old records, things that had once been important and had since become part of the background of his life. He opened the drawer and began to sort through them. Addresses, old contacts, names he had not thought about in years. He did not expect to find her there, but he looked anyway. Each piece of paper carried fragments of a past that had once been immediate and had since become distant. Some names he recognized instantly, others required a moment. He set aside anything that might be useful, even if he was not yet sure how. The process was slow, not because it was difficult, but because each step required him to acknowledge something he had long avoided. That time had moved without him, that whatever he was looking for might no longer exist in the way he remembered. By evening, he had gathered a small collection of possibilities, old addresses, a name connected to the school where they had met, a contact who might still remember something. It was not much, but it was more than nothing. He sat back in his chair, the papers spread out in front of him, each one representing a path that might lead somewhere, or nowhere at all. For a moment, doubt surfaced. What was he expecting to find? What would he say if he did? The questions did not have clear answers, but for once, he did not use that as a reason to stop. He reached for the phone. His hand did not hesitate in the same way it once had, not because he felt certain, but because he understood something he had not before. Waiting had not made things clearer. It had only made them quieter. He picked up the phone and scrolled through the contacts he had just written down. The first number belonged to someone who had worked at the school years ago. He did not know if it was still valid. He pressed the call button. The line rang, once, twice. This time he did not hang up. He listened, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed the moment to continue. The search did not end quickly, nor did it lead him in a straight line toward anything certain. Instead, it unfolded in fragments, in conversations that offered partial answers, in names that connected loosely before dissolving again into uncertainty. The first call led to another, and then another after that. Some numbers no longer worked. Others connected him to people who remembered pieces, but not the whole. Time had done what it always does. It had scattered details, softened edges, and rearranged lives in ways that made the past difficult to reconstruct. Still, Bob continued, not with urgency, but with a steady persistence that felt unfamiliar to him. For once, he didn't wait for clarity before acting. He moved forward without knowing where it would lead. A week passed, then another. One afternoon, he found himself sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of him. Names and dates written in careful lines, connections drawn between them like a map that was still being formed. It was not precise, but it was something. The name that finally brought an answer was not one he expected. It belonged to a former colleague of Maggie's, someone who had worked at the school years after Bob had left. The connection was distant, uncertain, but it was enough. The call lasted longer than most. The voice on the other end was older, slower, carrying the natural hesitation of someone searching through memory. They spoke about the school first, about the years that had passed, about changes that had reshaped everything that once felt permanent. And then, carefully, Bob asked about her. There was a pause, not long, but long enough. "Yes," the voice said finally, "I remember her." Bob felt his grip on the phone tighten slightly, not noticeably, but enough. "She moved away," the voice continued, "a long time ago. I think it was somewhere out west. Colorado, maybe, or Oregon. I'm not entirely sure." Bob nodded, though the other person could not see him. He waited. "She got married," the voice added after a moment. "Had a good life, from what I heard." The words were simple, neutral, not heavy, and yet they settled into him with a quiet finality. There was no dramatic revelation, no sudden shift in tone, just information, clear, complete, and out of reach. Bob thanked the caller. They exchanged a few more polite words before ending the conversation. The line went silent. He remained seated, the phone still in his hand, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The room felt the same. The light had not changed. The air remained still. But something inside him had. He had not expected to find her waiting. He had not imagined that time had stood still. And yet there had been a part of him that believed, or perhaps hoped, that the story had remained unfinished, that something could still be resumed, but now he understood. It had not been paused, it had continued, without him. Bob placed the phone down slowly. His hand lingered for a moment before withdrawing. There was no immediate emotion that followed, no sharp sense of loss, no sudden regret that overwhelmed everything else. Instead, there was clarity, a quiet recognition of something that had always been true, but had never been fully acknowledged. The past did not wait. It did not remain available. It moved forward, with or without you. And sometimes, by the time you choose to return, there is nothing left to return to. That evening, Bob returned to his chair by the window, the same place where he had spent countless hours watching the lake shift under changing skies, listening to the quiet rhythm of a life that had rarely demanded more than observation. But this time the stillness felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. The lake stretched out before him, its surface reflecting the fading light in muted tones that blurred the line between water and sky. There was something familiar in that image, something that mirrored the way memory worked, where details softened, merged, and eventually lost their sharpness, even when their meaning remained. He thought about her, not as she had been in the photograph, not as she had appeared in his memories over the years, but as she had lived, in a life that had continued, expanded, changed. He imagined it, not in specifics, but in possibility. A different city, different routines, conversations that did not include him, moments that had taken shape without his presence. It was not painful, not in the way he might have expected. It was complete, and that, more than anything, forced him to confront something he had avoided for most of his life. The moment in the phone booth had not been just one of many. It had been a point of direction, a place where one path ended and another began. At the time, he had believed that not choosing was a form of neutrality, that by waiting, by holding back, he could avoid consequences. But now, he understood that not choosing was, in itself, a choice, and it had shaped everything that followed: his marriage, his relationship with his son, the quiet distance that had settled into his life over time. None of it had been inevitable. It had been built, slowly, quietly, from that one moment outward. Bob leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together, his fingers interlaced in a way that suggested thought more than tension. For years he had carried the idea that something had been taken from him, that life had simply unfolded in a way he could not control. But now he saw something different. Nothing had been taken. Something had been left unsaid, left undone, left unanswered. And everything that followed had grown around that absence. He let out a slow breath, his gaze shifting from the lake to the phone resting on the table beside him. It looked the same as it always had, unremarkable, ordinary, and yet it no longer represented the same thing. It was no longer a reminder of what had been missed. It was a question, one that had not disappeared with time, only been delayed. The room had grown darker, the last traces of daylight fading into a quiet evening that settled gently over the house. Bob remained seated for a while longer, allowing the stillness to stretch without interruption, as if giving himself time to understand something that did not require explanation, only acknowledgement. The phone sat within reach, not distant, not hidden, present. For most of his life, he had treated moments like this as something to be postponed, something to approach later, when conditions were better, when thoughts were clearer, when certainty replaced hesitation. But now, he understood something he had not before. Clarity did not come before action. It followed it. He leaned forward slowly, his movement deliberate, not rushed, not forced, but intentional in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet entirely necessary. His hand reached for the phone. This time it did not hover. It did not pause halfway. It moved. He picked it up and held it in his hand, the weight of it steady, real, no longer symbolic of something distant, but of something immediate. For a moment he looked at the screen, not searching, not waiting, just present. There were numbers there, names, connections that had existed for years without being fully used. One of them stood out. Daniel. Bob's thumb rested near the screen. There was still a fraction of hesitation, not the kind that stopped him, but the kind that reminded him of what this moment meant. Not a perfect conversation, not a rehearsed explanation, just honesty. He pressed the call button. The line began to ring. Once, twice. The sound felt different now. Not something to endure, but something to follow through. 3 times, and then a click. Hello. Daniel's voice carried through the line, familiar yet slightly distant, shaped by years of conversations that had remained on the surface. Bob did not respond immediately, not because he didn't know what to say, but because, for the first time, he was not searching for the right version of it. He began, then paused briefly, not to retreat, but to continue more honestly. I've been meaning to call you. It was not a perfect opening. It was not profound, but it was real. There was a slight shift on the other end of the line, a moment of silence that felt different from the ones they had shared before. Yeah? Daniel replied. Everything okay? Bob exhaled slowly, allowing himself to remain in the moment rather than step around it. I think so, he said. I just realized I haven't said a lot of things I should have. Another pause. Not uncomfortable, not empty, just open. I'm here, Daniel said after a moment. The words were simple, but they carried something that had been missing for a long time. Bob nodded slightly, even though it could not be seen. I know, he said quietly, and for the first time in years, he didn't stop there. The conversation that followed was not perfect. There were pauses, moments of uncertainty, sentences that did not come out exactly as intended, but it continued, and that was the difference. Outside, the wind moved across the surface of the lake, carrying the same quiet rhythm it always had. The house remained still. The night settled in, but something had changed, not the past, that remained exactly as it was, but the present, for the first time in a long while, was no longer waiting.